All right, good afternoon, everyone, from here in Washington, where the IMF World Bank annual meetings kicked off yesterday. And I'm very pleased to welcome you all to the 2022 Bretton Woods Committee International Council Conference. This is our opening session. We have a great panel of speakers lined up here today. So I'm just going to make a few quick comments off the top before I turn it over to them. We have really an action-packed week this week of really high-profile events. So appreciate you all joining us today and hope to see you throughout the week for some really critical conversations. The theme of this year's International Council is making multilateralism work. And that is, of course, central to the Bretton Woods Committee's mission and mandate. And all week we're going to be discussing how multilateralism can be made more effective to meet current and future global challenges. And there's no shortage of those as we gather this week here in Washington. We've heard yesterday already at the bank fund meetings here, the economic outlook is rather difficult right now. We know that we continue to face high inflation, soaring energy and food prices, the risk of a global recession, and of course, many countries are now facing increased debt distress, which is the topic of our conversation today. So before I turn it over to our panel, I just want to remind our audience that, as always, we will save time at the end for audience questions. If you do have questions, we ask that you type them in to the Q&A function in the Zoom toolbar. We'll collect these and then we will unmute individuals when it's time for Q&A. I also want to thank our sponsor of this year's International Council, Standard Chartered. Very much appreciate their support. So let me quickly introduce our speakers now. We have with us today Keiyu Jin, who is an associate professor at the London School of Economics and is joining us from China. So thank you for the unkind hour, Keiyu. Very much appreciate it. Susan Seagal is the president and CEO of the Americas Society, Council of the Americas. Mark Walker is a senior managing director at Guggenheim Securities. John Lipsky is a senior fellow and distinguished scholar at Johns Hopkins University's SAIS. And he, of course, is the vice chair of the BWC board and co-chairing our work on sovereign debt. And finally, moderating today's conversation, we have Mr. Sovereign Debt himself, Mr. Bill Rhodes. Bill is president and CEO of William R. Rhodes Global Advisors. He chairs our sovereign debt work along with John, and he is also a vice chair of our board. So John, Bill, thank you so much for your leadership of the Sovereign Debt Working Group. And thank you to all of our panelists who are members of our Sovereign Debt Working Group. So we have our sort of internal group of experts here leading the discussion today. So without further ado, Bill, let me turn it over to you to kick us off.
Thank you very much, Emily, and thank you and our members and guests are connected remotely. I've been involved in the debt restructuring process and have written extensively on it for over 40 years. With scarce public finances directed to servicing a sovereign debt, I think, crisis in many countries, many of these low-income countries are doomed to a cycle of unsustainable debt, which has been further fueled by climate impacts, the COVID pandemic, and other disruptive shocks to the present financial crisis, which I think has now been increased by the Russia-Ukraine war. Things are difficult now for a number of emerging market countries, but could get worse. And we've seen this pattern in recent historical cycles, like the Latin American debt crisis, the Asian financial crisis, which were caused by chronic overheating of the economy, rising interest rates, which caused contagion from one country to another and disrupted their financial systems, and unfortunately disrupted the financial system of the world. Together with my colleagues at Bretton Woods, we have put together a sovereign debt working group, and our mission is to put forth specific, actionable recommendations to improve the global debt resolution architecture in anticipation of a wave of sovereign debt restructurings resulting from multiple global crises initiated here and I think ignited by COVID-19 and Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. The working group's two initial reports outlined the major weaknesses in the sovereign debt architecture and previewed the working group's priority issues, which include enhancing debt transparency, promoting equitable burden sharing among all creditors, achieving full and constructive private sector participation, and exploring prospects for state contingent financing. The Sovereign Debt Working Group is currently in the process of drafting our third report on equitable burden sharing and private sector involvement, and we're targeting a release in the spring of 2023. The objective here is not merely to address what more needs to be done to avoid a widespread sovereign debt crisis, but rather propose solutions that can be implemented to develop a coordinated debt resolution infrastructure and how we can better incentivize disclosure both through market-based and policy-based approaches. In today's discussion, members of our working group will share some of the early insights into the issues we are addressing in this report. My colleague, Mark Walker, will now share some of the specific thoughts we have on the newest report on private sector involvement and equitable burden sharing, which I think is so important right now in the context of what's going on in the world. So Mark, the floor is yours. And I want to thank you and Rich Cooper for the great work you have done on the earlier reports.
Thank you very much, Bill. It's a pleasure to be here, and I thank everybody who's participating in this program. As Bill said, I think the work that we're doing is particularly timely. Not only are there an increasing number of countries, not just frontier and emerging market, but also middle market countries in distress or on the brink of distress, but there's also a withdrawal of funds in the market available for these countries. Emerging market bond funds have seen tremendous outflows, new issuances are way down. So at a time of increased need for funding, there are in fact fewer resources. Of course, the official sector is an important provider of funds for sovereign borrowers, but it's not adequate. And that's recognized by the official sector itself. First of all, there's a question of amount, but beyond amount, the official sector are not natural lenders to support ordinary government expenditures over the medium and long term. That's not the role that they have assumed, nor do many people think it's the role that they should assume. And so over time, countries have turned to the private sector, and there is an uneasy relationship, indeed, I would say almost broken relationship, between the two principal sources of funding, the private sector and the official sector, both of which are needed. There is a sense of mistrust on both sides. The private sector in many cases thinks that in times of distress, the official sector wants to put all the burden on them. The official sector thinks the private sector is just there to make massive profits, although frankly, people who buy in the primary market, who are the real lenders to these countries, if you look at developments over the past decade, are not making massive profits. Some people in the secondary markets, yes, but the people who actually make the loans in the first instance are not. So you have a need for a cooperative approach and a system which frankly is not encouraging that. So the paper that we're working on in the Sovereign Debt Working Group focuses on two things. It focuses on how do we encourage the private sector to continue to provide funds, and a related matter, how do we make sure that the private sector engages constructively when debt relief is needed? They're related importantly because if you're a private sector investor faced with a choice of whether to lend money to a lower credit quality sovereign borrower, you have to ask yourself not only what are the terms of my loan agreement, what are the interest rates, what are the repayment terms, what do I think my economic return will be, but you also have to ask yourself, how will I be treated? What will happen to me if the country runs into difficulty and can't perform as expected? Because that risk, almost by definition, is greater than if you're lending to an advanced economy. So thinking about the worst case scenario, or maybe not the worst, but a bad case scenario, is inevitably part of the decision-making process of a private sector investor. So I say, I think right now the efforts to the official sector has made since April of 2020 an attempt to try to improve the sovereign debt architecture to provide more assurance of relief to the poorest countries. The so-called DSSI, Debt Service Suspension Initiative, and the Common Framework are addressed to the 73 poorest countries in the world. But those initiatives are really public sector initiatives in the sense that they try to bring public sector lenders together, in particular in the case of the Common Framework, to try to integrate China, which is by far the largest single lender to these countries, in a common approach. But the role of the private sector, although acknowledged in the sense that they were expected to participate, requested to participate by the official sector, DSSI, and are a part of the Common Framework in the sense that any borrower country participating in the Common Framework must invite the private sector, but is not required to ensure their inclusion in a process where, in both cases, the terms of the relief are dictated in advance by the official sector alone and not the private sector. That is a process that fuels mistrust. It actually, I think, reversed some efforts to try to increase cooperation. And what we're trying to do in our working group is to find ways to change that dynamic, increase the participation of the private sector. We're not saying it's all the fault of the private sector, it's all the fault of the public sector. I think there's plenty of blame to cast, but it's not a question of blame. It's really a question of trying to find a better mechanism. So to try to give you just a hint of what we're doing on the first part, where we look at how to encourage participation, I think our opening observation is, how do we find a new model for cooperation between the official and the private sector, which must begin with a better understanding of each of what the roles, objectives, and legitimate interests of the others are. They serve some different purposes. The private sector, of course, by definition, has as an objective to make money. That is not the principal objective of the official sector. But there's nothing wrong with making money. There's nothing wrong with providing debt relief as an official sector, or providing debt finance in the official sector. So we're going to try to look at clarifying the roles and see how perhaps that might lead to modifications of the approach that is embodied in the Common Framework. Secondly, we're going to look at important ways to adjust allocation of risk between the public and private sector. Some might say, well, you're really just trying to find subsidies for the private sector, find guarantees or first loss absorptions or contingent backstops, political risk insurance and the like, all of which are interesting and legitimate approaches. But the idea isn't to provide a subsidy. The idea is that to the extent that you can reduce the risk and share the risk better, as is done, for example, in public-private partnerships, then the private sector will not only be encouraged to provide more finance, but can do so at much cheaper borrowing rates to the benefit of the borrowing countries. In addition, a number of the techniques that we're exploring will allow the official sector to better leverage its own capital. So if an official sector borrower can lend $3 for every dollar of capital, but with a partial guarantee of 20% of a loan can encourage $5 of new investment, you're leveraging the investment. Other techniques that we'll look at are contractual techniques that may relate to tax treatment, to accounting treatment, contingent obligations. There have been many examples since Mexico's Brady deal where sovereign borrowers have issued contingent warrant-like instruments, so-called value recovery rights, which in theory provided a way to encourage the private sector to give greater relief in exchange for possible upside if things turns out well. Those instruments have been poorly designed, either because they were designed, and I plead guilty to some of this, in such a way on behalf of the country that it was highly unlikely that they would ever pay, or they were poorly designed in the other way, like the recovery rights in Ukraine and at one point in Argentina, so that they provided windfall recoveries to the private sector. So there are things that we are looking at that are, as Bill said, specific and operational that we think will be helpful. On the question of comparable treatment, that's an issue that arises in the common framework which specifically says that relief provided by the private sector must be at least as great as that provided by the public sector. That language is acceptable, meaning that it could be much greater. At least as great doesn't mean equal. But the private sector, if you're coming into any restructuring, this is not unique to sovereign debt. Creditors want to make sure that they're fairly treated. They don't want to be disadvantaged vis-a-vis other creditors that are similarly situated. They don't want to be disadvantaged vis-a-vis lenders like the IMF that are putting up new money, but who set the terms in which the old money is treated. And they don't want to be treated differently from official creditors who have put in money in the past or putting money in the present. And so the relationship on three dimensions: private creditors among themselves, private creditors in the IMF, private creditors in the official sector, are really critical issues in order to disabuse people of misunderstandings and feelings of that they're being mistreated, but also to encourage people to participate in a common venture for which will provide better outcomes for all. So that's my summary. The paper will be much more detailed, but we look forward to working on this and any questions you may have. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you very much, Mark, for the work you're doing. KU, thank you so much for getting up or staying up so late. I'm going to say getting up so early, depending on how you look at it. And if you have a chance, you might mention that you're writing a new book, which will be publicized shortly. What basically I want to ask you is that China is going through a very difficult economic cycle. You have a bust in the real estate and property area, all of the lockdowns with COVID. I think some of the problems with the One Belt, One Road collections. And of course, as has been mentioned here earlier, China is the largest creditor nation to the emerging markets. So given all of that, how do you see things working out going forward with China's role in the sovereign debt crisis and the emerging markets in general?
Thank you, Bill. And it's a pleasure to be with everybody here from Beijing. We are, of course, eagerly waiting the agenda set out by the Party Congress in about a week, where we'll see clearer the economic priorities. And I do believe that, given that Chinese economy is at a very low point, probably one of the lowest in decades, the focus back on the economy and getting it back on track will take center stage again, which would be good news. All of these have implications on Chinese domestic priorities, but also international strategies. And since China's debt is increasing significantly, not quite at the point to which there will be a full-blown financial crisis for a variety of reasons. For one, the state can coordinate between the lenders and the borrowers, and the state coffers, the central state coffers are there. So I don't think that this will impinge on its lending, international lending, to a great degree at this point. But there are significant changes in the way that China is thinking about the Belt and Road and international investments as it comes to almost a decade since the starting point. So let me try to elaborate a little bit on the Chinese perspective of some of the issues that were raised in terms of international lending. Now, I think over time, there has been a lot more lessons learned. One thing that is consistent with the general economic strategy in China is to play the long game, to reevaluate, rather than to resort to unbridled growth, unbridled expansion and lending, that fervor, that drive in the earlier days. It's now much more careful. It's reviewing, it's raising the quality of lending. There's lots more data on looking and examining the kind of the fruits of these lending. So that, along with some international pressure, means that China is going to slowly, slow down the international lending. But from its own perspective on equal or fair burden sharing, why and how it can participate more with international coordination, I think it's a shifting perspective. And it goes to show when China has participated in the SSI and common framework, that under the right circumstances, China has a great incentive to participate. And of course, it wants to have a bigger voice in the setting of the global rules and international institutions or design, etc. So there's that incentive. However, there's still a divergence in interest, in incentives and mechanisms when it comes to these sovereign debt issues for emerging markets. In terms of China's vision or China's own experience, may be that it believes that some of the principal or large amount of principal haircuts or debt cancellations might not be the right strategy, might not be the right approach when it comes to tackling the debt issues for certain countries. It too has been an emerging market developing country. For instance, it believes that in some cases, these kind of debt restructurings or principal haircuts could hamper many of these countries from accessing international debt markets, or the fact that if you give them fresh new loans at a lower cost, these are cyclical matters that they can kind of overcome with continued financing, or the fiscal conditions that are imposed on them by the IMF and others would hamper, their ongoing growth. So there is a divergence in certain cases of, what the right approach would be. There's also the sense that there is potentially disproportionate loss for the Chinese lenders. As Bill mentioned, China is the biggest bilateral creditor. And lots of these loans are of a different nature, investing in heavy infrastructure with heavy capital assets, somewhat different from the nature of lending of advanced economies, which is, from what I know, in education, services, and culture, etc. So it is concerned with a disproportionate loss falling on China. And of course, the greater representation of the G7 advanced economies in the Paris Club. So what it seeks is to have a broader representation with the likes of big emerging markets, potentially embracing a multi-dimensional, more up-to-date package for debt resolution, rather than in what its own view is a more formulaic or cookie cutter single solution. It believes that some of the Paris Club rules or methods and approaches are a bit out of date, given that China is, in its view, more sensitive to developing countries' needs, their access to international markets, which has grown significantly in private sector participation, etc. So I think the interest and incentives are there. It's not quite there yet. There are still a lot of problems with the new resolutions and common framework, etc. But I think this is just giving a flavor of how the Chinese are thinking, given that it is one of the biggest creditors in the world. So let me stop here.
Just a follow-up. Do you think that the situation with the debt to GDP in China reaching almost 300%. I know the People's Bank of China, the central bank, is concerned about that. Plus this slowdown, I mentioned the bust in the real estate area. I did an article in the South China Morning Post about it, which was circulated widely in China and translated in Mandarin. Is this going to pull back China at all in not only the One Belt, One Road process of lending, but make it more difficult for resolution of emerging market problems? Or do you think that after the Party Congress and that's through, that China will be more open and more flexible in this regard? It's a tough question to ask you at this time, but I have to leave you with that because I know you're a very straightforward speaker on this issue.
I do believe that the openness, liberalization, market prevailing, despite what we're hearing from media and all sorts of avenues outside of China and even inside China, will continue. The reason is that at a really low point in the economy, that's actually when the harder commitments are made. And there is between the pendulum between a bit more Mao and a bit more Deng. I think it's going to swing towards a bit more Deng, even if it's not vocally expressed that way. But I do believe, given my conversations with various policymakers, that will be the direction. So that partly answers your question, Bill. But to resolve the debt issue internally, the government has in mind what they call exchanging time for a bit more space. So deleveraging has to happen and has been rising, but there are short-term pressures on the economy. And look, these quick fixtures to the economy, the cheap credits, the resorting to the property sector, they're no longer that potent. And because the fundamentals driving the private sector is no longer there. Think about, I think there were 7 million new marriages only half of the previous year for the shrinking youth cohort. So I think these debt issues will be resolved over time. I don't think there's a general sense that there will be a full-blown financial crisis at this point. And therefore, the primary drivers for international lending is still not, the domestic concerns. If we were to come to the point where there will be massive defaults and there will be significant fiscal pressure, then I would say that would be the case. But as I mentioned, the international drive is a longer term issue. And as I will write an op-ed published in a couple of days, China playing the long game, also related to my book, highlights that search for more sustainability.
Thank you very much. I think it's very important for our audience to hear China's viewpoint, and particularly from somebody like you who has researched it so much. So now I turn to my co-chairman there, John Lipsky, former deputy managing director of the International Monetary Fund and actually acting head of the International Monetary Fund at one point in time, to talk about the common framework, what the G20 is doing, why most people think the common framework has failed, and what he thinks ought to be done and should be done and will be done in this regard.
Thank you, Bill. Very simple problem, simple questions. But thanks for your work in this area. And Mark, thanks for laying out the case for the work of the Sovereign Debt Working Group of the Bretton Woods Committee. And KU, thank you for your comments, your very perceptive comments that we just heard. And we look forward to both your op-ed and your book. What was the idea of the common framework? Well, the idea of the common framework was to recognizing that if anything, the problem of debt restructuring and sovereign debt, especially of low-income countries, was likely to become much more acute in the coming years, in a context in which it was completely clear that the pre-existing Paris Club framework had become dysfunctional. Let's call it a word. The common framework was a worthy effort of the G20 to attempt to create a new framework that built on the old Paris Club, that had some important principles involved, but also some important flaws. The two important flaws, I would say, of the Paris Club, one is self-evident. China, which had, in the wake of the global financial crisis, became the largest single lender to low-income countries, was not originally part of the Paris Club, and it's not so shocking to find a reluctance to simply join a club whose rules were set before their engagement. Secondly, the Paris Club always was controversial with regards to the engagement of the private sector, and especially from the point of view of private sector participants, that they felt underrepresented in the process. And similarly, private sector engagement or private sector lending in this area have become increasingly important. So the idea was to try to find some new mechanism, the common framework that would encompass and improve the situation or the architecture in a situation in which it looks like significant tests are on the way. That insight that tests are coming seems to be quite valid. It's the set of circumstances that have given rise to the current situation, both in financial markets and the global economy, make virtually certain that we're going to have the anticipated, unfortunately, the anticipated wave of debt problems, especially of low-income countries. Therein lies, or I should say, let me turn, why then, with this good intention, is it commonly viewed that the common framework hasn't lived up to its succeeding in the task set for it? And I would say quite simply, there are four clear problems that still remain to be overcome. One is the scope of the common framework is strictly limited to low-income countries, and yet it is entirely possible that the coming year we will see debt problems engulfing some middle-income countries. And in fact, although some may be surprised to hear it, Sri Lanka does not fit within the common framework. It is not within the low-income countries within that framework. So we already have a difficult case that doesn't fall within that framework. So the scope is probably too narrow. Secondly, there has been a decided reluctance of even those low-income countries eligible to participate in the common framework to participate. And that is because they feel that they have felt concerned and a reasonable concern that a application for common framework treatment would immediately lead to a credit rating downgrade, and hence would immediately cut themselves off from new lending, even if they had not yet fallen into default. In other words, if they wanted to move preemptively to some kind of new arrangement, even before having defaulted on their debt, that they would be, in essence, cut out of the market. So that's a second problem that has to be dealt with. What we've seen, and I think you've heard implicit in what Keyu said, is we haven't really worked out a situation with the Chinese authorities and the Paris Club that everyone feels comfortable with dealing with debt in a similar way. There's concern, is what you heard Keyu saying. There's different concerns, different types of debt, has to be very sensitive to this type of debt. But of course, that was one of the goals of the IMF in dealing with these, and not just the IMF, but the Paris Club in creating the architecture, was equal treatment, fair treatment of different kinds of debt. It turns out it's very complicated, and it's clear that has not yet been solved. And as a result, we don't have a smooth and efficient system, even under the common framework. And then finally, what you heard from Mark Walker is certainly that the common framework has not solved the concerns of the private, hasn't done anything really to solve the concerns of the private sector, that their treatment is less fair than they would want. there are two particular aspects of this. One is an important part of the common framework, as it was with the Paris Club, was the judgment of the World Bank and the IMF through their debt sustainability analysis of exactly what the scale of the problem was of the countries participating in the common framework. The private sector has no input and doesn't see that analysis until almost the end of the common framework process. They feel like, why don't they have some input into this, even though the result of the debt sustainability analysis be very important in setting the terms. And finally, the official creditors committee formed under the common framework do not include private sector participation. Hence, the private sector continues to think that they are being dictated to by an official bodies, even though their participation or their exposure can be very large. Bill, I've gone on a little too long, but we've got, and I hope I made it clear, this is a good effort, but it's still got a long way to go to make it work.
Thank you very much, John. Let's hope these meetings at the IMF World Bank come up with some new ideas and suggestions on how to implement that. Lastly, I turn to you, Susan, who's a veteran of the Latin American debt crisis, runs the Council of the Americas, and has the best feel and knowledge of what's going on in Latin America than anyone I know. And how you see this today with countries like Argentina, Venezuela, Ecuador, moving forward, with all of these problems that we're seeing that we've mentioned here, with the situation of COVID, the war in the Ukraine, et cetera, the slowdown in the Chinese economy, which is now one of the major creditor nations, also one of the major investors in Latin America. So how do you see this from your perspective, and what do you think ought to be done?
Well, Bill, I have a slightly different perspective than when I look at Latin America than I've had in a long time. And the reason for that is that Latin America, for the first time, has what the world needs. They have food, they have minerals, lithium, copper, gold, and they have energy and an abundance of energy. And so from my perspective, while I think what you're talking about is absolutely right, the common framework, how do we get the official sector more involved? For the first time, I have heard many people, both in the public sector and the private sector, step in and say, how can we help some of these countries? Because what they have, we need right now. And so I think, we're at a really, really interesting inflection point in many countries in Latin America. As we've discussed, inflation is rising, interest rates are going up, although some of the middle income countries and the upper income countries really borrowed for, very long term at fixed rate. Now, when that comes due, that will be a major problem. But today, looking at today, yes, they're outliers, et cetera. But today, looking at today, that's where we are. And so, at one point you said, I think countries have to be proactive, not reactive. And so I think countries still need to manage and think about their fiscal policy. They still have to worry about their monetary policy. But they're also at a very important point because so many countries have elected presidents that have promised a stronger social safety net and a much stronger social agenda. And this is front and foremost in the thinking of many, many different countries today. So, they ran on platforms of better education, better healthcare, and a strong social safety net. And we're at a very different point than we were in the 1980s, because in the 1980s, we were really talking about, a fiscal adjustment. We were talking about the first round of financing. A lot of these countries have reached high income status or middle income status, but the amount that they spend on social programs is much smaller. So there are a lot of different competing demands in the countries. So, as I look at this, I think that, we also have a bunch of really good central bank and independent central bank governors And they are going to have to remain independent and stand alone to fight inflation. Inflation is one of the biggest problems in front of the Latin American countries today. So the question of, how can the public and private sector kind of work together? I think there are a whole bunch of really important issues. I think a lot of countries in Latin America still need to put together a clear and predictable legal framework for investment. And if they do, in my opinion, it will move the needle in terms of needing to borrow less and being able to get more FDI for the very reasons that I started my conversation. Companies want to invest, they just want to be sure that they're going to be able to be there long enough to see the return on their investment, a very different kind of engagement. Second thing, which I think is really important, is that the public sector themselves, many countries in Latin America are saying, well, gee, I'm into public-private partnerships. I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to define them, how they're going to work, but we know we need them. We know we need the private sector in some way or another. And I think that is a real opportunity to change the way we look at Latin America. And, another way would, in my opinion, really be to use the multilateral investment banks. The debt for nature swap that took place in Belize, that looks an awful lot, Bill, like what we used to call debt equity swaps. And I think that as you look at a country like Venezuela, I know companies that are already headed to, and individuals to Venezuela with cheap debt that are willing to swap that out for the right kinds of investments in the country. In fact, I think there are a number of countries in Latin America, but particularly Venezuela, where in a country like Venezuela, yes, there will be all kinds of challenges. China will have a big problem in Venezuela, along with Russia, given the level of debt. But the fact of the matter is, the remittances, if you see a democratic or a move towards democracy, you see the US lifting or beginning to lift the sanctions, you begin to see the opportunity. There will be remittances, there will be private sector investment. We're living, I think, in a very different time. So yes, they will have to deal with restructuring, et cetera. But even some of the most recalcitrant creditors in the world have said, gee, I bought this debt cheap. Can I turn it into an oil asset? Can I turn it into something that makes sense for me? That doesn't mean that all of them will, but at least there's a basis on which there is a discussion and a common discussion among some of the private sector creditors. So, that isn't to say that, there aren't issues in places like, in some of the smaller countries. Clearly the Caribbean is going to be different in many ways. But I think that, I come back to what I said at the very, very beginning. Right now, Latin America has a lot of what the world needs, and they need to just figure out how can they get their investment environment together, make it a reality.
I think you make some very good points, but particularly on debt equity, because that's something that Mark had brought up also. And I think a lot of these countries can really move forward on that basis. But, every time we see the same movie with rising interest rates in the United States and what the reaction is in Latin America, and maybe you might want to say a word about Argentina, because it's like, don't cry for me, Argentina, because all of the various opportunities in the sense of commodities exist in Argentina, yet they're the largest, debtor nation to the International Monetary Fund. And of course, Ecuador just did a deal with China. And you mentioned Venezuela and some of the problems existing in Chile. And Chile is moving ahead very nicely, but in Peru. And the question is, do you think these countries can manage these opportunities that are there? Because I can't think of a country in the world that has more in the way of the resources that we're talking about than Argentina. So doesn't it really get down a lot of this to the ability to manage?
I think in a place like Argentina, it really gets down to being able absolutely to manage and set a framework where companies feel comfortable investing over the medium and long term. But I have been quite interested to note that there are a number of mining companies and energy companies that are actually investing in Argentina, and that Argentina finally has figured out that, and the local Argentine businessman, that some of this they're going to have to do themselves, which is also, I mean, you think about the pipeline that's being built by the energy companies in Vaca Muerta to get the energy to a port. They never would have done that kind of investment before, but it's very compelling. Also, you know, interestingly enough, behind this, the US in terms of, you know, opportunities to support some of the activities with the private sector involvement, US private sector involvement, is also beginning to change. But more importantly, I mean, we've seen this when you're a major creditor to any institution, whether it be the IMF, the World Bank, or the private creditors, that is a shared responsibility on both sides. Argentina can't afford to default to the IMF, but the IMF also can't afford to let Argentina default to them. So it seems to me that they have to find a way to work together to move this forward. And I actually think that appointing Sergio Massa, who is not an economist, but does understand how to get things done in Argentina, is a positive step forward. That isn't to say that it's done or anywhere near done. But I actually, when I was in Argentina in August, I felt more optimistic than I had in a while that they were beginning to go down a path that made some sense.
Well, I hope your optimism is rewarded with actual facts going forward, because all the things you say about the commodities are there. The question is the ability to manage it in an efficient and honest manner.
Yeah, let me make one other comment, which I think is really, really important in the context of the world today. Argentina, Chile, Brazil, and many other countries in Latin America are proving to be really strong democracies. And I think that that is something which is really important to the US and to Western Europe, the strength of the underlying democratic process. I think for the first time that is helping them in the context of an international community believing that they have to be supportive because the democracies have to continue to be strong in the context of everything that's happening in the rest of the world.
Well, I hope you're correct, and I hope the subtitles on this movie are going to be different from what we've seen in the past. Having said that, I'd like to thank our panelists, but turn it over to Emily to field questions. We still have, I think, we don't have much time, but we still have about 15 minutes or so, Emily.
Yeah, thanks, Bill, and thanks to all of our panelists for covering several different viewpoints there. We do have a few questions from the audience. I would like to go to Ted Truman first. Ted, your microphone should be unmuted if you want to go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you very much. So I put my question in writing, but I was talking with David Wolford this morning with a group of Treasury alumni, all of them who were well past their sell-by date. And he was commenting that the markets are not, the people thinking about debt are not sufficiently imaginative about how they could use the modern techniques of the market. Now, I wasn't able to pin him down on this, but he left the impression that because there's the techniques are developed and investors have much more different preferences, that there might be ways of, if you want to put it that way, packaging debt, where I assume you could talk about either official or private debt, in ways that would attract the market and be more successful. I don't think he was thinking about debt for nature swaps, which has an old idea. Actually, I taught at the Treasury that this is actually a dumb idea, but I'd be interested if you have any thoughts of this, or in your working group, you've had any thoughts about how really new techniques, in some sense, the Brady operation was a new technique, but it's not really available today.
Well, I think it's an interesting question, Ted. And of course, you're a veteran of all of this restructuring process in the 80s and the 90s. And as far as David Mulford goes, I think he may be looking for a new Brady plan. It's interesting. The Ukrainian government is reaching out to me in this regard, asking me for my experience with a possible Brady plan for the Ukraine. But Mark, I know you seem to be interested to make your comments in this regard. So why don't you say something on it?
Sure. Well, Ted, it's a good question. And actually, if you look at the first report that our working group did on transparency, we tried to do just that, to look at techniques in the private markets which were designed to promote transparency. And we're doing the same thing here. I mean, if we talk, for example, how do we encourage investment in municipal bonds in the United States? We do it, and perhaps in other countries, we do it by providing tax exemptions. What did the U.S. government do at one point, and you were there at the time, Ted, to encourage people to restructure? That was to working with the accounting firms, provide and allow better treatment in terms, or more lenient treatment in terms of requiring write-offs. There are a number of techniques in the way debt is packaged, yes, but also terms and the way markets work that I think could be adapted to sovereign debt and facilitate greater investment and reduce the risk of default. The climate resilient bonds that are being used in some of the Caribbean countries are an example where if certain natural disasters occur, there's a period of forgiveness or deferral of payments. So there are a number of things I think, and I think David's right. There are things there's more creativity for obvious reasons in the private sector. It's a big market, and a number of those techniques can, and I think, will be used. Public-private partnerships, again, are another example, which I mentioned at the outset.
Mark, I thought you were going to say something about state contingent debt.
I can. That's our next thing. But that's, state contingent debt where payments can be deferred on the occurrence of certain events which make it harder for a country to comply with its payment obligations, which are somewhat like, for example, so-called PIK payments, payments in kind, where in the private sector, under certain circumstances, a borrower, instead of making a payment in cash, will make a payment of interest by delivering additional bonds or increasing its capital, capitalizing the interest payments. And so state contingent debt is something we're going to look at in some detail. Climate resilient bonds are one form of that. Another could be to look at exogenous events that interrupt economic growth or provide sudden stops. Pandemics was a perfect example, and try to find ways that would ease the ability of countries to work their way through crises rather than to have a default and be forced to sit down and restructure. And it's a little bit like, but not quite like, some of the things that China is considering when they say, well, we can lend more money. I don't think they're not the same. And then there's some fair amount of criticism about giving extra loans without conditionality, because in the end of the day, it increases the debt. But capitalizing interest isn't very different from making additional loans. So I think there are ideas that could be of use.
Yeah, John, you had a comment, I think.
On this, well,
The question on Ted's question.
oh yeah, it was yes, and I thought Mark would add on state contingent debt, which is a version of it. As Ted knows, there's very little new under the sun. So modern, so-called modern financial techniques have been tried before, but it certainly it seems probable to us that there are innovations in format that could prove useful here.
Yeah, Susan?
Yeah, but I think all of these, I mean, what's unique about what Mark said and John said, all of these are innovative kind of new ways that incorporate some of the old ways, but are innovative ways that the public and the private sector can work together to create a path to resolve the debt. And maybe this, if the common framework isn't working and we can't find a common basis, maybe this path we're going to have to go down, you know, almost country by country, finding innovative solutions that work for that country as well as its creditors.
Yeah, that goes back to your debt equity side. KU, China keeps coming up in this regard. Do you have any thoughts on Ted's question and the comments made by the other members of the panel?
Yeah, I think China's view, I mean, at a very high level, is to think more innovatively about solutions. That is, kind of more attuned to today's circumstances, market development, participation of private creditors, access for international markets for a lot of these countries, which should not be put in the same bucket in its view. Some countries are doing better than others, even if they run into similar situations in debt. So I think very broadly, this is actually what China is looking for, to have more of a balanced, a new framework to cover these issues, new techniques, new creative, from what I understand, new creative solutions that, touches upon, financial markets and a multi-purpose kind of package. So I think that's broadly in line with its views.
Well, I always remember Zhou Xiaoshuan, the former governor of the People's Bank of China, used to always tell me, he said, Bill, there's a lot of criticism of China for not being flexible enough on the debt restructuring. But remember, we were the ones who put money in on a new money basis when other countries didn't want to do it. So I think we always have to keep that in mind, which is one of my concerns with the cutback of One Belt, One Road, which hopefully, as you say, after the party Congress, we will see more flexibility and new initiatives come forward. And as I said, we're all waiting for your book and now your op-ed. I think we have time for one more question, Emily.
Yeah, in the interest of time, I'm just going to kind of ask a wrap-up question here. We had a few questions on sort of how is the character of debt changing as kind of political fragmentation continues to occur, and also, how do we get Africa to this conversation? I mean, there's a UNDP report last week that, basically raised alarm bells on the urgency of this issue. We're kind of having deja vu here. I feel like we've been talking about this at World Bank, IMF meetings for, a couple years now. So maybe just kind of final thoughts on the urgency of the situation and how to get the debtors more involved.
Yeah.
John, why don't you start off on this with the situation in Africa?
Thank you. Well, we've been talking about, Emily, you're absolutely right. We've been talking about this as a problem heading our way, and now it's here. And we haven't done enough to make the system work in an efficient way, and we're going to have to do it on horseback in the middle of a fire. So it's suboptimal, but it's going to require, if we take a step back, the big problem is there have been so many changes in so many aspects of sovereign debt market, in terms of borrowers, lenders, et cetera, that we've lost sight of a system that makes everyone think it's fair, that the system is fair. We need to solve that in an acceptable way, in an urgent manner. I worry, can it be done? But it has to be done one way or another, or it's the debtor countries that are going to suffer, and they're the ones who least ought to.
John, do you think that the IMF and the World Bank and the multilateral development banks are really doing enough in Africa? There's a lot of questions marks there, particularly from African nations, which is one of the reasons they turned to China, because they felt that the multilaterals weren't really doing their job. This is for you, John.
Oh, thought that was for Mark.
No, I'm going to get to Mark. This is
Yes.
still for you.
Yes, yes. More needs to be done, more concentrated. But we don't have time to get into details. The answer is obviously yes.
But this is a teaser for when you interview David Malpass tomorrow. So I'm sure you will bring it up and can mention that. Mark? I think you're muted.
Sorry, the same question on multi.
Yeah, the same question.
In
I think
Africa?
we'll talk a little bit about Africa because you've been looking and working on Zambia and other countries in Africa. So,
Look, it's very slow. It's a very difficult, market because there's a paucity of information. And frankly, there's not a great deal of willingness by many participants to share information, including, I'm sorry to say, in Zambia, China. And that has helped slow things down. But, and there are questions of governance. There are questions of corruption. There are questions of monitoring policy implementation, all of which make it difficult for people to lend. There's a lot of lending in Africa, which is resource focused, not just by China, but focused on projects. And that has actually been somewhat more successful. But I think at the end of the day, there hasn't been a real focus on how to make things better. One thing I will mention, and I don't know, I can't say for sure if it's true, but during the initial stages of the pandemic, when I was working with the UNECA, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, we worked with the private sector to put together a private sector working group, which was composed of a lot of investors in Africa. And they offered to sit down, indeed, they met a number of times with African finance ministers, and those were interesting meetings. They pleaded with the multilateral development banks to sit down with them, and they were entirely ignored. Nobody in the official sector was willing to engage with them, which was really, I think, unfortunate, because these are people who had a lot of exposure to Africa and were anxious to continue if they could do it in a way that they thought would be somewhat protective of their interests.
So Keo, you have the final word. I know that apart from the work that you are doing and speaking from the Chinese point of view, the London School of Economics has got a group that's looking at some of these issues also. So feel free to give thoughts on that as sort of a closing statement to this issue about Africa.
Clearly, emerging market debt crises from a research point of view is also at center stage. So I think there will be exciting developments on that front. Now, China is, of course, a major creditor to Africa. And I think we ought to see the kind of evolution of the types of lending, of the quality of the lending, of the kind of the countries in which it's exchanged in Africa, and debunk a lot of the myths or speculations, partly fueled by somewhat China's non-transparency, of course, but now there's substantially more data that we can examine. And so it points to an evolution, for instance, in the kind of countries it's engaged with, including working more based on projects, lending based more projects rather than with sovereigns, etc. So let me just say finally that there's also internal voices. There's internal dissension on these issues. There is internal voice and pressure on greater transparency, kind of better coordination, more engagement, international coordination. And I think that is a very positive first step. And as I mentioned in the beginning, it is absolutely in China's interest to have a greater voice and to be part of the design of these important international architecture.
Well, I think this is a good positive way to end this session. And we look forward to both your book and your op-ed and
Thank
all
you.
the work you're doing at London School of Economics, and hopefully your view will prevail in China. So I'd like to thank our panelists for their great input here. And I hope, Emily, that you are satisfied with what we've put forward here. And I'd like to thank Elena for the work that she's done helping put this together.
Yeah, and thank you all very much sticking with us for a few minutes over time here. Thank you very much to our panelists for joining us and to our audience. I think that was a wonderful opening session for International Council. We continue at 2:30 with a conversation with Alexia Latortu, the U.S. Treasury Assistant Secretary for Trade and International Development. So everybody take a break and join us back here in a few minutes for the next session. Thanks again, everyone.
And thank you and the audience
Bye-bye.
and the panelists.
Thanks, everyone.